Good afternoon. Welcome to Don't Say Gay, Stop Woke, Banned Books, and Anti-Trans Laws, Teaching Through the Backlash. This event was organized by the American Historical Association's Standing Committee on LGBTQ Status in the Profession to consider and to contextualize how historians are responding to new laws that roll back decades of curricula and censor LGBTQ and racial content, and I should say more than that, depending upon the state. And one thing that I very strongly recommend is that as you're listening to this conversation, think about reading the legislation that has been proposed or passed in your state, because this legislation that we're going to be discussing this afternoon is often reported in the media incorrectly, inaccurately. The summaries are often simplistic. Read the legislation yourself and then write to your legislators. And we'll also be talking about this kind of legislation and activity, not only in the United States, but around the world. I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association, and I am pleased that we have so many people who are attending this afternoon. This webinar will run for 60 minutes. In the first part, panelists will offer brief remarks, which will be followed by a Q&A with the audience. Audience members may submit questions using the Q&A function, and questions will be compiled by my colleagues on the AHA staff. You may also submit any teaching-related resources that you'd like to share with the other attendees in the Q&A, and the AHA will distribute them after the event. Please note that this event is being recorded as well. I also want to remind everybody that the AHA is member and donor supported. I'm sorry for the commercial, but I need to do it. Some of our work is funded by grants, but programs like this rely on the support of our members and our donors. Programs like this are run, in essence, on the general operating budget. We will post in the chat box links to our membership and donations pages, as well as some additional information about the event. I strongly encourage you not to click on the membership or donation page until you've listened for a while, to make sure that this is something that you do, in fact, find interesting and useful. Today's panel will be moderated by Claire Potter, Professor of History at the New School for Social Research. Claire is a historian of United States political history after 1970, the history of gender and sexuality, mass culture, media, and internet studies, and yes, all of those things, and the chair of the AHA's Committee on LGBTQ Status in the Profession. Claire has also chaired the AHA Program Committee and done all sorts of other things, some of them more quietly than others, because I often rely on Claire for advice and even more than that. And am very grateful to Claire for moderating this panel and for everything else that she does. We're thrilled to have Claire leading the discussion today. And I will now hand this over to Claire, who will introduce the rest of the distinguished panel.
Thank you, my friend. And back at you, Jim. I am so happy to be here today with this wonderful panel. And I just want to start by saying that we put it together before the fracas about the AP standards in African American history. But I think moments like this remind us how much people in queer studies have in common with our friends in African American studies and ethnic studies when it comes to challenges to what we do. I'd also like to say that I think a moment like this helps remind those of us in college and university teaching how much we have in common with our colleagues in high school and at community colleges around the country. And I hope these bonds can be strengthened by a discussion like this. I want to introduce our panelists. Anita Kurimay is Associate Professor of History at Bryn Mawr College. where she currently serves as the Director of Gender and Sexuality Studies. Anita specializes in modern European history with an emphasis on East Central Europe. Her main research interests include the history of sexuality, women's and gender history, conservatism, and the politics of the far right, as well as the history of sport. Wesley Phelps is an associate professor of history and director of undergraduate studies at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, where he teaches courses on recent United States history and queer history. His research focuses on how democracy operates at the grassroots level and how marginalized groups of people have struggled to participate in the democratic experiment. And Jeremy C. Young is an old friend and the senior manager of free expression and education at PEN America. In this role, Jeremy advances PEN America's advocacy for free expression in educational institutions, advocates against censorious legislation, and politically motivated efforts to ban concepts and curricular materials. Jeremy supports academic freedom in higher education and the freedom to read, learn, and teach in K-12 schools. A former history professor, Jeremy Young holds a PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University. So I'd like to start with Anita, because Anita will help us understand this moment in U.S. history in a global context. Anita, take it away.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for being able to be at this panel. Such an important time. So yes, we often think of the US as a trendsetter and exporter of ideas. However, in the case of Don't Say Gay law and the banning of critical race theory and the culture war around LGBTQ issues, the US actually has been following the playbook of East Central Europe, and in particular, Hungary and Poland. From the moment Fidesz and Viktor Orbán came into power in 2010, gender and LGBTQ issues were elevated to a culture war, where gender and LGBTQ rights were seen as ideological imports of Western liberalism and hedonism, and have been systematically attacked ever since. They became the boogeyman and initially conveniently distracted from the corruption and self-serving policies of the ruling Hungarian party. This was also the case in Poland, where the Law and Order Party came into power 2015. And both of these parties created what critics call illiberal democracies, essentially destroying democracies from within by limiting freedom of the press, the judiciary's independence, delegitimizing oppositional parties, and consolidating most forms of media in their own hands. In the name of protecting the traditional family, which is of course strictly heteronormative, and children who, according to these narratives, were endangered by gender talk and predatory queers. All this sounds very familiar, as the anti-gender movement is now a global movement. And what is happening in the US, of course, is reflective of the transnational effort of white Christian nationalists to spread their agenda in the name of protecting traditional family and children, and of course the nation. But there's a reason why Orbán and the Law and Order Party in Poland have become celebrated in these white nationalist circles. And the reason is simply that they have been the most successful in overhauling the education system, which is the topic for our conversation today, in both countries, and making it the battlefield in the culture war. So I want to give a flavor of the escalation of the policies that have been passed in the past 10 years, and also serve, I would argue, as a blueprint for US politicians in Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. So both Hungary and Poland centralized both higher and secondary educations, with putting political figures into decision-making positions, while also making the firing and dismissal of teachers a much easier process. Concomitantly to putting white nationalists into their educational leadership, Hungary banned gender studies as a discipline from higher education, considering as an ideology and not an academic subject. And both countries now refuse to provide any research money, resources, or even positions to people studying gender and sexuality, unless people study and reinforce the idea of traditional family. In Hungary, a law recently was passed that banned teaching about homosexuality and transgender issues in schools in the name of preventing child abuse. Of course, the same law equates homo and queer sexualities with pedophilia. At the same time, in both Poland and Hungary, sexual education now means education for family life and religious teaching about the importance of marriage, which is constitutionally banned for same-sex couples. Anti-LGBT campaigns are used to bolster the re-election campaigns of both Hungarian and Polish ruling parties. For instance, in the last election campaign, the government-sponsored billboards around both Hungary and Poland trumpeted the question, "Are you afraid your child could be exposed to sexual propaganda?" So furthermore, I would just also highlight that both Poland and Hungary consolidated public schools under the single national curriculum and mandated the use of history textbooks that glorify white Christian nationalism while playing down or simply exclude presenting historical racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and discriminatory policies in Hungary's and Poland's histories. So the backlash and the concerted efforts were experienced to minimize the 1619 project or water down the AP course in American history in the US has been also a copy of the Hungarian-Polish education policies that, to quote the Polish Minister of Education, was intended to get rid of the education of shame and replace it with the education of pride, end of quote. In particular, instead of dealing with the complicated histories of the Hungarian and Polish complicity and active participation in the Holocaust, the new national curriculums in both countries erase any national or individual responsibility for aiding and participating in the Holocaust. And in the case of Poland, even criminalize any public speaking that equates the Polish nation with responsibility. In the new history textbooks, ethnic Hungarians and Poles can only be heroes or victims. Of course, these policies met with outrage, and in both Hungary and Poland, there have been a concerted efforts by teachers, students, and parents to counter these policies, which at times even brought education to halt nationwide. Young people in particular have become politicized to an unprecedented degree, and there is some hope that their newfound civic engagement will help bring about a political change, which at this point could only happen if Fidesz and the Law and Order Party could be defeated in future national elections. At the same time, both governments were quick to react to the success of the protest and pass new regulations that curtail the rights of teachers to hold strikes. Students cannot be left unattended or sent home, and the minimum teaching has to be upheld. In addition, strike days are deducted from teachers' salaries, and given the education salaries artificially being low by design by both countries, many teachers have to think twice about whether they can afford losing even a fraction of their income, not to mention being dismissed for not teaching the right way. So I fear that Poland and Hungary are not only warning signs, but offer a stark picture of where the US is heading in Republican-led states. But in the spirit of the time, I want to stop here and give the floor back to Claire. Thank you for your attention.
Anita, thank you so much. I think next we're going to go to Wes to take us to ground zero in a state that is increasingly affected by some of these laws. Wesley, will you take it from here?
Thanks, Claire, and thanks so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. We've seen state government officials over the last few years use this blueprint out of places like Poland and Hungary that Anita talked about to enforce some of the same goals. They have some of the same goals as these European governments. And we see this most clearly in Florida, where there are now serious threats to academic freedom and freedom of speech. We're also starting to see it where I am in Texas. There are some state legislators who are following the lead of those in Florida. And I'll just give you a couple of examples here. In 2021, the Texas legislature adopted and approved an anti-critical race theory bill. Although most of the bill's text is incredibly vague and it never even mentions CRT in the bill. It's called an anti-CRT bill, but doesn't mention CRT in the language of the bill. I think this gets back to something that Jim said at the beginning, that we need to know what's in these laws. We need to know the precise language that's being used. And in the case of Texas's anti-CRT law, it's very vague, but there's one part of it that has a clear mandate. And it says that in public school history classrooms, slavery and racism can only be taught as, quote, deviations from the founding principles of the United States. In other words, not something that is built into our structure, not something that's built into our founding documents, but something that can only be taught as something that is a deviation from those founding principles, which of course flies in the face of about 100 years of scholarship. The State Board of Education has decided to delay. They've decided to wait until 2025 to make major changes to their history standards based on this new law, which means that we have from now until then to make our voices heard about how to go about this. This year, the legislature is back in session, and they're considering several bills here in Texas that would further limit the decisions that educators can make in their classrooms. Let me just give you a couple of examples. House Bill 1155 would ban classroom instruction about sexual orientation and gender identity in grades K through 8, but it would also empower local administrators to ban any discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity if they deem it not to be age or developmentally appropriate. Puts a lot of power into the hands of local administrators to determine what can and cannot be discussed in a classroom when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. And of course, the rationale behind proposals like this is just what Anita said, this conflation of being queer with being a pedophile. House Bill 338 establishes a content rating system for books, and it would require all book publishers to assign their books a rating, which the legislature has laid out for them. But it would also empower local school boards to change those ratings that had been assigned by publishers, and it would they could then disallow books whose publishers refuse to assign the rating that the school board actually wants. So once again, putting a lot of power into local school boards to take books out of libraries, to remove books from curriculum, and the power to kind of refuse to use certain books because of this rating system. And then finally, House Bill 1006 would force all publicly funded universities to be, quote, socially, political, and culturally neutral in everything that we do. And again, this gets back to Jim's warning about the vague language of these laws. I'm not sure exactly what culturally neutral means. But one specific thing this bill would do is that it would ban any office of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It would also prohibit asking students and faculty to affirm a commitment to diversity, equity, or inclusion. So we're starting to see an effort to control what we're doing in higher education as well. It's hard to say if these bills are going to be approved and what amendments will be added to them, but it's clear that there is quite a bit of support for these measures in Texas. I think what we need to do moving forward, and I hope that's what we'll get to today, is we need to find effective ways to make sure we know how to articulate the importance of the kinds of history that's going to be outlawed with these kinds of regulations. And I think we could start by establishing networks of support between higher education and K through 12 teachers. And I'll stop there. I look forward to our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And I now want to turn to Jeremy Young, who will give us the big picture around freedom of speech, freedom of expression, what's possible, what's not possible, and how our friends over at his agency can help us think about these issues and how we can push back against them.
Thank you, Claire. And it's a real pleasure to be here with this audience. So I work at PEN America, which is a 100-year-old free expression organization with a membership of professional writers. And we, for most of our existence as a free expression organization, human rights organization, have been primarily involved in supporting free expression among writers who are being censored or threatened or jailed for their work, generally in other countries. But in the last 7 years, PEN America has begun to do work on education issues and around censorship in the United States as well. And in particular, over the last a little over 2 years now that we're in 2023, we have been deeply concerned about what we call educational gag orders, these so-called divisive concepts or anti-CRT bills that have been proposed in state legislatures around the country. These bills were they grew out of the backlash against the New York Times 1619 Project and the racial reckoning of the George Floyd protests, and began life as an executive order in the Trump administration, introduced in September 2020, Executive Order 13950, on race and sex stereotyping, which banned a series of so-called divisive concepts, a very vague list of ideas, some of which are obviously out of bounds, such as that one race is superior to another race, but others of which are very vague and might ban discussion of the existence of affirmative action as a policy position or of reparations as a policy position, among many other things, would ban those concepts from trainings in federal agencies. That executive order was never in effect. It was stayed by a court and repealed on the first day of the Biden administration. But once it became clear that it would not become law at the federal level, an avalanche of similar language bills began to emerge at the state level. We have there were a lot of these in 2021. There were an overwhelmingly larger number in 2022. At this point, we've tracked over 270 of these bills across the last 3 legislative sessions. 140 of them appeared in 2022 alone, which was a 250% increase over the previous year. And these bills, while the original or the very first of these bills applied these restrictions primarily to, to the trainings at state agencies, the more recent versions, the vast majority of them apply restrictions to classrooms, both at the K-12 level and at the college level. And indeed, college has been an increasing focus of this legislation. Only 30% of the bills introduced in 2021 referenced colleges and universities or applied to them, but 39% in 2022 applied to colleges and universities, and the percentage seems, if anything, to have gone up here in 2023, which, as you may know, the legislative sessions are currently active. So this is we're observing this as it's happening. In all, 19 states now have a version of this legislation on the books, either through a law that has passed, or an executive order, or some sort of a state policy, including 7 states where it affects higher education specifically. And a couple of those states, only higher education is affected, not K-12. Now that takes us to where we are today. And I should say, PEN America, as a free expression organization, is deeply concerned about these bills, in part because their vagueness and the strength of the prohibitions and the penalties, coupled with the vagueness of the text of the law, leads to a profound chilling effect. It's very difficult for teachers and for administrators at universities and K-12 institutions to know exactly what is banned. And the understandable impulse is simply to ban everything. Any mention of race or gender or sexual identity in any context, to avoid any possible interpretation of the law that could lead to some sort of a penalty being imposed. And those interpretations, one of the things that we encourage people to do is not to read things into the law that aren't there. These laws are vague. They don't reference a lot of specifics. If they don't specifically prohibit something that is relevant to your work, then they don't prohibit it unless you're being told otherwise. Now, what we're seeing here in 2023 is a new wave of this. For those of you who have been paying attention to the news, which is probably many people on this webinar, last Tuesday was the higher education equivalent of a day that will live in infamy. In Florida, the governor introduced, or didn't introduce, there's no legislative text yet, but proposed a series of laws that would constitute the most draconian restrictions on higher education ever instituted in the United States. Among other things, these laws would not only ban DEI and CRT initiatives in every state university in the country, they would give control of core curricula at all of Florida's universities to a single system-wide board appointed by the governor. They would give boards of trustees unchecked power to hire and fire faculty, effectively ending tenure protections. They would unilaterally rewrite universities' mission statements, force colleges to deprioritize certain majors deemed to further a political agenda. And finally, at the same time that this bill was proposed, the governor's newly appointed board members at New College of Florida, who constitute a collection of out-of-state political pundits rather than higher education experts, voted on their first day in office to fire the president of the university and proceed with a complete teardown and restructuring of the institution along the lines that's being proposed elsewhere in Florida. So what we are starting to see emerging here is a threat that goes beyond the censorship of individual classrooms to the censorship and regulation of entire universities by the government, where normal university functions that are controlled as part of shared governance, decisions being made about mission statements, about hiring and firing, about university policies, will now be made if these folks have their way by politicians in a state government or those directly appointed by them. So what we are facing is a truly existential threat for higher education. And, you know, I'm just glad everyone's here on this call so we can talk about it. And I'm glad everyone's here in particular at this this gathering of the American Historical Association, which has been one of the leading organizations in the country in fighting this threat and advocating for honest history education.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I just want to highlight a couple of things before we turn to some of the questions in the chat. One is that Ron DeSantis, who we think is going to run for president in 2024, has promised to do for the rest of the nation what he's done for Florida. So this is a threat in Florida. It is a threat in a number of other states. And Jeremy, we had a question in the chat as to which are the 7 states that are currently being affected by these laws. If you have that off the top of your head, if you don't, it's fine.
Absolutely. It's Florida, Iowa, Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Mississippi, and South Dakota.
Okay, thank you so much. The other thing I would like to say is we have a question in the chat, which I think we could pursue further about how we can become involved in actively fighting the censorship. And it's from an educator in Florida. And, you know, what we're seeing here, and which is a much bigger issue than the subjects that are being banned, is politicians taking over higher education. And, you know, one of the reasons they're able to do that is elections. And one thing to pay attention to, particularly if you live in a state where these things are being bruited about, is school board elections. One of the things conservatives have figured out is that it takes $2,000 or $3,000 to win a school board election. Very few people even know who's running for school board. Run for school board. That's really, really important to see who is on the school board. Is there a vacancy? Should you be running for it? You know, conservatives have known this for years. Phyllis Schlafly once said, the most important vote you will ever cast is your vote for school board. Take them seriously. And I'd like to toss another question from the chat out, which is the question of, are openly gay teachers being purged in Eastern Europe or in some of these states? Are we seeing people actually losing their jobs for violating these laws? And Anita, I wonder if we could start with you.
Thank you. I mean, recently there were over 2,000 teachers who were fired in Hungary in secondary education, and they were fired because basically they did not want to follow the new textbooks, and they were just not going to what they said, teaching the new fascist curriculum, which again glorifies you know, anti-Semitic, racist, nationalist figures in the past. In terms of LGBTQ identities, it's a little more complicated because the whole, you know, we have to we have to reckon with the existing homophobia that kind of requires people to keep their sexual orientation private to begin with. So it's a larger question, but absolutely, in terms of the surveys that LGBTQ organizations done about teachers, you know, sexual orientation and how welcome and how protected they feel at work, that there are still some protections that they have, so they cannot be openly fired, but they again cannot be really out to begin with. So it's a little more complicated situation, but teachers do not feel at all that they can be out and visibly. Basically now they are banned to talk about gender and sexual politics. So that's in and of itself says it a lot, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think, Anita, you bring up an important point, and particularly in the United States, the history of sexuality and the history of race has been so mainstreamed in curricula. You know, we're not going to see identities really fully aligning with who is troubled by this curriculum. We're going to see a lot of people formerly known as allies who are going to be extremely troubled. Wes, are we seeing fears in Texas about people losing their jobs?
I think the fear is there. I don't know. Jeremy might have a better sense of whether this is happening on if people are actually losing their jobs. I only know anecdotally of a couple of instances, but I think the culture of fear has definitely kind of taken hold among, especially public school teachers, on what they can and can't say in the classroom and what might get them fired. And I'd like to go back to something, Claire, that you mentioned about grassroots politics and just echo what you said. I think that's where we're going to have to go with this. We're going to have to vote. We're going to have to get other people to vote. We're going to have to run for local elections. School boards, I think, is a great idea. It's really going to take that kind of grassroots organizing to get anything done. And I think we're going to have to figure out a way to articulate this to people who might not otherwise care about these issues.
Right.
We have to figure out a way to explain to people why learning this kind of history is really important for us. So we've got to learn how to talk to people, and we've got to learn how to organize.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I just want to inject something else into the conversation, which is we're also talking about librarians here. And librarians have often been on the front lines of anti-censorship initiatives, particularly after 9/11. The American Librarians Association really pushed back against Homeland Security, wanting lists of people who had taken certain books out. Jeremy, have we seen job loss in Florida because of these laws?
Nothing significant. It's exactly what Wes is saying. The actual firings, there have been one or two. There have been some cases where it's murky. There was a notable case in Oklahoma last year where a teacher shared a link with her students to the Brooklyn Public Library's banned books website and was fired for doing that. Although the firing, she was disciplined for doing it, and she then decided to leave her job. But what is definitely happening is and a lot of this has to do with the way this first wave of laws has been phrased. These laws are very vague. They are not necessarily designed to be enforced very often, perhaps only once in a while to make an example of a particular person or district. They are designed instead to instill fear, and that is exactly what they're doing. A couple of excellent reports from the RAND Corporation over the last couple of months have demonstrated this. One showed that 24% of all teachers, K-12 teachers in the country, had been told by a senior administrator either in their school or in their district that they were not allowed to teach various controversial concepts because of the laws that were being implemented. And when you keep in mind that these laws have only actually been implemented in about a third of the country, that's a very high number. And a second survey looked further into the data and found that the censorship, being both self-censorship and administrative censorship being applied to teachers, was higher, disproportionately high among African American or Black teachers, and particularly African American or Black social studies teachers, of whom 50% had been told in some capacity that they were not able to teach something relevant to their discipline because of the laws or political pushback. So the chilling effect is real. The censorship is going on essentially outside of the law. It's going on as people who are in many cases motivated by the best of intentions, by trying to engage in the prudent management of risk and avoid painting a target on their school, for the legislature carry out the censor's work for them by going beyond what the law actually requires.
Right. And I certainly think one of the things we're seeing in Florida, and I have a question here from Trinidad Gonzalez. Have those of you on the panel been observing the conservative effort to eliminate accreditation requirements for higher education institutions? This is a flanking effort to help facilitate changes to tenure and freedom of speech. I would expand that a little bit. Recently, Ron DeSantis made it possible to teach secondary school in Florida without having a college degree. And so the idea that, we can in fact lose all kinds of accredited teachers and replace them with, as DeSantis was thinking, maybe military veterans would be good people to do that. So what about the shifts in accreditation standards? Anita, did that play any role in Hungary and Poland?
Yes, they changed the requirements for become to basically to lessen the bar to become teachers. But it's also what is important. There are other ways in which by basically not providing a competitive salary while other areas seen a significant raise. It is also a kind of a counter selection that happens, that they really don't want young people aspire to be teachers. They really limit the appeal, both in terms of what they can teach and these laws that are actually, ban, actually not just they're not at all in some cases in the US, they're much more concrete, and they make sure that they know that they cannot teach anything about gender and sexuality. But so they're giving even the textbooks, but then also make sure that the teachers who teach it, they are not aspiring intellectuals. They're not seeing this as a mission to educate the future generation, but rather people who really can't find any other job. And so therefore, it's also diluting the profession and the appeal through other means, which means that, again, ultimately, they end up with a less educated future, basically Hungarians, and that's in their interest in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Wes, what have you seen in Texas?
I haven't really seen any efforts to change accreditation, but what we have heard talked about by state officials here in Texas is revising post-tenure review procedures for faculty to really make it easier to dismiss faculty, to get rid of faculty who, violate these new rules about what can be taught. So I think we're seeing it at least talked about more in the realm of how do we discipline the faculty who are already there. But I don't know, Jeremy might know about more efforts to, weaken accreditation requirements as part of that effort.
So Florida, thanks, Wes. Florida legislators think that they've essentially destroyed the accreditation system by passing SB 7044, which requires all universities, in public universities in Florida, to switch accreditors at their next accreditation cycle. The problem is most accreditors have similar standards for evaluating institutions. So changing accreditors isn't really going to get those schools more ability to censor their faculty. It's just going to cost them millions of dollars to go through the process of acquiring a new accreditor. The real threat here has to do with potential attacks on accreditation that could come at the federal level should folks who are pursuing this at the state level take control at the federal level. But at the moment, 83% of students receive federal financial aid, and that is tied by federal standards to accreditation among one of these 7 regional accrediting bodies. So there isn't too much they can do at the moment. That said, it's enough to convince the accreditors that maybe this is, if they can avoid a fight here, it's probably to their benefit.
Right. Yeah. And, I want to pull something out of one of the questions that was asked to say, part of what the people who are pushing these laws would say is that they don't want us to stop teaching history. They want us to teach facts and not values. And I want to thank the questioner for bringing that up. And what they mean by values is, of course, what we often call critical thought, or what we often see as analysis. I think if you ask Ron DeSantis, what does woke mean, which somebody did recently as a press conference, and I was so glad, he said, it means believing that there is structural discrimination, right? So what these laws are about opposing the idea that there are structural inequalities of power within the United States, and that those things are intrinsic to what this nation is. So that, I think, is a really important thing to think about. The other important thing to think about is how much we have not fought back to make arguments for the humanities. And I know a lot of people would say they have, and we've tried and so on, but really those arguments for the humanities have to go back into the political realm. We cannot just talk about them at the AHA or the MLA or in our local faculty meetings. So I think that's really important. We have another question here that says, the strategy of appropriating liberal progressive rhetoric has been so successful for the right in the past half century. How do we engage in discussions around free expression, identity, discrimination, etc., without playing into the right's rhetorical traps? For example, conservatives now claim free speech as their issue and claim to face viewpoint discrimination in higher education. How can we fight back without reifying this framing? Jeremy, I'm going to have to start with you on this.
Well, I'm happy to take this, and there's another question that this references as well about whether PEN America speaks out in defense of conservatives' freedom of conscience, and the answer is we absolutely do. We in fact, a lot of our campus free speech work involves speaking out against a sort of censorious culture that has emerged on campuses on the left. You know, we're not shy about that. We're not afraid to defend someone like Ilya Shapiro when he's threatened for saying something on Twitter. Right? We are willing to make those arguments. I think we have to understand that there is a difference in scale between a culture of censoriousness, and which we can certainly see emerging from the left, and the actual censorship by the government of speech through laws and policies. And that, I think, is the key difference here. You know, when we talk about appropriating frames, for many years, conservatives have had this very popular argument that government intrusion in people's lives is bad, and that the better government is less government. Well, that has been completely abandoned in terms of what's happening on campuses here. The truth is, government incursions on university life are the centerpiece of how this is playing out. And until that stops, it's going to be difficult to go back and talk about those cultural issues. We do talk about both, but really, we have to emphasize that difference in scale, and I think that allows us to take that rhetoric back as well.
Yeah. Anita, in a European context, what would you say to that question? Has there been a similar appropriation of liberal progressive rhetoric?
Absolutely. And I would think East Central Europe is very different than Western Europe because of the legacy of state socialism, which we have no time to go into, but absolutely that some of these ideas were brilliantly used by these, right-wing nationalist governments. And again, I think the difference is perhaps that because they were able to take hold and put their crownies into all the university leadership, essentially they beheaded any response from the universities and essentially from the education realm, because there is no freedom of speech, and there's also no a way to counter now the appropriated arguments about essentially these ideas that these are cultural values, and these are just opinions as opposed to historical facts when it comes to actually discussion about historical injustices. So I think the situation is more dire, way more dire, and again foreshadows what could happen if this kind of agenda becomes elevated to a national policy, which it has in both Hungary and Poland. So basically, you no longer have a response that you can counter these appropriated messages.
Yeah. And thank you very much, Anita. And we have a question from Ellen Schrecker, who says faculties have to unite here. What can they do? I wanted to toss this to Wesley, in part because Texas has such a robust system of community colleges. And Texas has historically put a ton of money into public higher education. What is the conversation among colleagues about what to do at in the event that these laws are passed in Texas, and how to reach out to and make common cause with with secondary school teachers?
Yeah, and I think that's where we are in this battle right now. I don't think we've really established those networks yet. I think that's what we need to start doing. We need to start the real organizing work of bringing faculty together, colleges and universities, community colleges, high school teachers. We need to find ways where we can come together and talk about exactly what you're saying, what these laws are going to mean for what we do in the classroom. I mean, I think we've talked about the vagueness of these laws quite a bit. We should be talking about what the laws actually are. What do they prohibit? What are we allowed to teach in class? And I think by creating those networks of support, we've got a much better chance of having our voices heard. And this kind of goes back to your previous question. I mean, I think what we've got to do is insist on teaching critical thinking skills. We have to continue to insist that that is an important part of our job. And critical thinking would show us how a lot of proponents of these kinds of censorious laws they have co-opted the language of rights. And Jeremy mentioned that there was kind of what he saw as a censorious culture on the left developing on universities. I'm not sure I'm seeing that here in Texas. We had an event here at the University of North Texas a year and a half ago or so, where we had an anti-trans person come on campus to give a talk. And we had a lot of trans students and allies show up to let that person know exactly what they thought of what he was saying. They then labeled that as trying to censor his appearance, trying to keep him off campus. So that language is being used. I think if we insist on teaching critical thinking, we can use that as an example of how some of these concepts have been co-opted and perverted by people who are, basically preaching messages of hate.
Well, and one of the things I'd like to just sort of toss in here is I don't think it's an accident that in the 7 states where these laws have already been passed and a number of states where they're being contemplated, they don't have teachers' unions. Okay. And so the destruction of teachers' unions and unionization efforts more broadly have actually helped to disrupt these networks. So they need to be reconstituted in other ways. I think Jim's going to speak to the role the AHA might be able to play in that. And we also, we did have another question about so-called left-wing censorship. And one of the things I'd like to ask the panelists is, have liberals and left-wing thinkers who believe in freedom of speech, have we been vociferous enough in speaking to our own people about what it means to shut down speech? And Jeremy, I know Penn has done a lot of defense, FIRE has done a lot of defense of people, regardless of who they are. But just digging deep into our hearts, have we done enough to say that we actually will support conservative speech as well?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, I think we can always do more, right? But it's a question. I guess I'll redirect the question a bit, because there have been 2 really smart studies that have come out on campus free speech in the last year that are really, above and beyond data that we've had before. One in the UNC system, and one that just came out this past week in the University of Wisconsin system. And what both of those studies have found is 2 things that really combined don't agree with what anyone thinks on this issue, which is, 1, conservative students really do feel silenced on campus, and 2, they do not feel silenced by their professors. They feel silenced by their fellow liberal students outside of class. They feel social pressure not to speak. They feel that they will be sort of ganged up on by people in common areas on social media. It's really a campus climate issue more than it is a classroom issue. In fact, they find really quite admirable rates of their professors supporting their right to speak and encouraging them to voice their opinions in a safe atmosphere in the classroom. It's outside of class where the problem occurs. So I think we have to reframe this whole issue and think about it as an issue of free expression education in in the student affairs side of things, in orientations, in campus events, just fostering a culture of open inquiry and free expression that is really in many ways outside of class. The studies say the faculty are doing a great job. It's the rest of the university that isn't.
Wes, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure, but I do think that makes sense that that there are conservative students who do feel like they're entering a liberal culture when they go to a university, and feel silenced in some ways by those other students. But I don't know. I think the kind of speech matters. Like the kind of speech that we're talking about really matters. We have a speaker on campus who says trans people shouldn't exist. That's not a free speech issue anymore. That's a threat to the presence of trans students on our campus. And when we allow that kind of speech, that kind of existential threat, we've failed our obligation to create this inclusive environment for students. So I guess I don't see it as a cut and dried free speech issue as much as we need to really pay attention to the kind of speech that we're talking about. And Claire, I agree with you 100% that we do need to be talking to like-minded people as well. I mean, I've been advocating for more dialogue with people who disagree with us, but we should be imparting to our students the value of open communication, of not censoring people's speech, of certainly speaking our own, but that a multiplicity of voices is valuable. I think we should be reinforcing that message for our students.
Anita, you teach on a small liberal arts campus, a women's school. What are you seeing?
Yes, and I really appreciated Wesley's point. I think there's just it's really complex. And I think, again, comparing to Europe, where for instance, there's really laws against Holocaust denial. And in terms of free speech, there's a little bit different in terms of there's really a hate speech that you can't be, basically, you can be denied based on, which is, under the US laws. I think it's more problematic. And I think it goes to this problem of their communities could feel that they are endangered by the speakers who could come and speak, right? And so there's a clash of interest, and I think so it's really more complicated in terms of being in a very liberal small art college. I think absolutely I could echo Jeremy's point about there is the cancel culture, and students feel even on the left, even liberal students, that they could say something wrong, that they could be saying something that is not correct, and they could be canceled. And that, unfortunately, I both see that in the classroom, but particularly in the age of social media outside of the classroom. So I think I would think about a different way of, thinking about education as basically a practice of failing, and the fact that we need to reform this idea of education is part of saying the wrong things and learning, and part of making mistakes. That should be so part of your college education, and particularly classroom discussions, ways in which you can change an argument. But that also means that basically what you said doesn't reflect who you are, and doesn't make these value judgment, doesn't bring about being canceled. And I don't know how we're going to go about this. I think social media really has a huge role, and I think we have to think about education in the age of basically the new chatbots and thinking about digital revolution. How are we going to educate? How are we going to rethink education? And I think it's going to be really, really important. But yes, I see a little, I hope I answered some of those questions.
We have so many wonderful questions here that we're not going to have time to get to. But there is one. And first of all, I'd like to welcome the room full of future history, social studies, high school education teachers who are watching us. Apparently, there's a whole class of people watching this. And the question is, if we have to learn how to talk, can you give us some advice on how to explain the value of having multiple voices in a curriculum or in your classroom? Can we just get a sort of rapid fire answer from the panel, starting with Jeremy, going to Wes, and then going to Anita, and then I need to let Jim back in to finish.
This is the toughest question, but it's the most important one, right? How do you tell people why what we do matters? And the answer is, I mean, there's many answers. One is, the truth is, if you, as the AHA polling demonstrated in 2021, if you ask this question in the right way, the vast majority of people agree that you should learn about the hard parts of history, even if they make you uncomfortable. This is not a controversial opinion. It's framed with all these misleading ideas and misleading concepts. So I would say, you tell people, that it's rooted in the mission of higher education and of K-12 education to serve students, to serve community. Communities need to understand people who are like them, and they need to understand people who are different from them as when they're young, because then they grow up and they become voters and leaders. And if they don't understand people who are like them or people who are different from them, they can't do that job effectively. And it really becomes an attack on democracy if people are not informed when they become adults. So that's the framing I would use.
Okay, Wes, quickly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that we need to emphasize that this is how knowledge is produced. I mean, if we are in the knowledge production business, this is exactly how knowledge is produced, by including this multiplicity of voices. And we can look throughout history at how we have arrived at the knowledge we have. And it's by including diverse voices and sifting through them and evaluating them. And I think that's what we should be training students to do.
Anita, you get to finish
Yes.
it off.
Echo everything what we said. I think for the next generation of global citizens, the world is only going to get more diverse. We want to put our senses in someone else's shoes, past or present, and try to, I think that's how we build empathy. That's how we understand each other as human beings. That's how we humanize different experiences. So I think it's crucial that we incorporate different voices, different experiences, try to see where they're coming from. Again, it's crucial for a generation of, empathetic individuals. Yes.
Okay, and Jim, welcome back. Maybe
you.
you'd like to close us out.
Yes, I want to thank our moderator, all of our panelists, all of our participants who have posted such wonderful questions and comments. And I want to emphasize that if you'd like to continue the conversation, Claire noted that a lot of comments were not able to be addressed. Please consider going to the AHA's member forum, which is in the community section of our website. A link is available in the chat, I think. And you can continue this conversation with other members of the AHA. Also, please consider posting in the Q&A any teaching resources that you want to share, or email them to ahaonline@historians.org. We will compile a list that we hope will be useful to everybody, but especially to the educators. And obviously, we have a lot of them among our attendees. I also want to note that the AHA's Committee on LGBTQ Status in the Profession is raising funds to support an annual $500 grant to support new and continuing research in LGBTQ history, and consider donating to that fund, which I believe we will have a link to the chat in the chat. And finally, I do want to thank Claire again and our panelists. Obviously, this was a stimulating conversation. I also want to very quickly note that there were some comments in the Q&A about whether the AHA or whether Penn also speaks up when the political valence is in a different direction. And we do. When there was a commission in San Francisco on school renaming, this is now in the chat. Please take a look at it. You will see that when the AHA saw something coming up from a different political direction, we spoke out then as well. So this is the issue of the integrity of historical work, the integrity of history teaching is important to us. And it's not a question of left and right. It's a question of doing our work correctly. Thank you, everybody, for speaking, attending, participating, and everything else that you do.